Welcome back to Domino Theory, the podcast about politics, business, and media, often with a slant toward Asia. I'm Christian Whiton, joined as always by co host Mark Simon. For this episode, we're pleased to be joined from Moscow by Fyodor Lukyanov, the prominent Russian expert in foreign affairs, research director at the Valdai Discussion Club, editor in chief of the publication Russia and Global Affairs, and faculty member of the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Fyodor can provide a unique and insightful view of how things look in Asia, Europe, and America from Russia, and how that differs from what our experts here perceive. But first, the lead in. How can President Donald Trump put America first in regard to Russia and Ukraine? It seems to be a question few are asking, even after this week's phone call between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. For a lot of people in Washington opining about the Ukraine war, this question doesn't seem to matter much. On both left and right, since the war began just over 1,000 days ago, most pundits have been trying to outdo each other in sounding hawkish and calling for greater U.S. involvement, rather than explaining why the situation matters to Americans, if it does. Implausibly, they say the United States had to defend Ukraine in order to defend democracy. For example, Mitch McConnell, until recently the top Republican in the Senate, said, quote, helping a Democratic partner defend its sovereign territory against an unprovoked attack from a common enemy is obviously in America's interest, unquote. Obviously. No further explanation necessary, apparently. We'll overlook the reality that Ukraine isn't a democracy, doesn't respect freedom of speech or religion, tampers with American elections, and may have just assassinated a Ukrainian dissident after he dropped off his kids at the American school in Madrid, Spain. Imagine a government that wants to be part of NATO, shooting dead one of its political opponents with his kids nearby in a NATO country. But the experts say Ukraine is a democratic ally, obviously. From the beginning of the war, those same experts said that ever increasing sanctions on on Russia would work, but they didn't. They said Putin was supported by oligarchs and that seizing their yachts would cause them to force his hand. That didn't work. They said that a succession of U.S. provided weapon systems like HIMARS, ATACMS, Patriot anti missile batteries, M1 tanks, and F 16 fighters would be radical game changers. But they weren't. They said that Putin not moving his hands in an even interview meant that he was sick. Then they said that Putin moving his feet in an interview meant that he was sick. Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, said of Putin, quote, he will die soon, and that's a fact, and it will come to an end quote. But it hasn't, obviously. We can afford Zelensky some leeway to deliver a little bit of spin. He is the president of a country that is slowly losing territory in a war of attrition with a much larger power. But the experts back here populating cable TV and other media probably ought to have a little more actual expertise. They might perform better if they thought a little harder about vital American national interests. At least McConnell and his friends in the former Biden administration imagined that real American interests were at stake. They said that China was watching and that the failure of America to practically give Ukraine a blank check would encourage China, which most Americans see as our top adversary. My take has been that China is indeed watching, but it is more than happy to have the United States distracted by Ukraine. It isn't impressed, it's amused. Beijing will certainly pocket the lessons learned on the battlefield about drone warfare, but U.S. actions in Ukraine won't change whatever Beijing has in mind to do. Therefore, putting America first might mean canceling the blank check, using diplomacy to end the war, and turning over support for Ukraine to Europe, which, after all, has more people than we do and nearly as large of an economy. Putting America first also means reestablishing some sort of modus vivendi with Russia. The Russians I've spoken with don't particularly cherish dependency on China any more than Americans do. And keeping Beijing and Moscow apart ought to be a top U.S. goal. Richard Nixon's opening to China, which was largely about isolating the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Today, we should do the opposite, engaging Russia, if not to isolate China, then at least to cause some sleepless nights in Beijing. To the dismay of Europeans and hawks in the Washington Uniparty, Trump has attempted diplomacy. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians think he is asking too much and promising too little, but at least he is trying. Left-wing Bloomberg News snidely reported the snide comments of European officials, writing that, quote, on a call last Friday, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, France's Emmanuel Macron and the UK's Keir Starmer tried to make it clear to Trump that Putin has been stringing him along. They are hoping that Trump will realize that he risks looking like a loser if he forces a bad deal on Ukraine. End quote. Certainly, those men know a lot about looking like losers, but they might consider a third option between their endless war and Washington forcing a deal on Kiev. Earlier this week, Trump said, quote, "I think something's going to happen. And if it doesn't, I just back away and they're going to have to keep going. This is a European situation. It should have remained a European situation," end quote. Trump famously vowed to end the Ukraine war before he even took office. He later said he was exaggerating, but ending the war was always going to be a tough job and will take more than a ceasefire and the right mixture of word salad. As a cynical friend of mine observed, the Russians are playing chess and the Americans are playing Twister. Prolonged war would be an unfortunate outcome since it would prolong killing. Even if Trump does not resume Biden levels of support for Ukraine, and he won't, it could mean continued U.S. sanctions on Russia that raise the price of energy for Americans and push Russia closer to China and Iran. However, Trump's statement is a recognition of the reality that putting American interests first might mean U.S. statecraft should move on from its hyper focus on Ukraine and the Biden era's de facto Europe first foreign policy. Who knows if Trump would then be willing to set aside the war to explore areas of cooperation with Russia, or if Moscow would even be willing to talk about much if Washington is still selling or giving arms to Ukraine and furnishing it with targeting information and other intelligence. A peace deal would be better, but as is so often the case in wars that always seem to last longer than expected, the fighting may have to go on in Ukraine. And Trump will have to decide to what degree he wants his second term's foreign policy to be dominated by the Ukraine war. And that's the lead in.